Gita, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Well, I wonder if we could start by talking a little bit about the Indonesian economy. When people think about global investments in Asia, the countries that tend to come to mind are the giants like China and India,
Correct.
and to some degree also Korea, Vietnam, and so forth, when you think of the emerging markets.
Right.
In this kind of a global environment, how do you position a country like Indonesia as a destination for international investors? And how do you use that to drive your strategy?
That's an interesting question. The way to do it is to project Indonesia with positivities in realism. We don't want to be swinging the pendulum too much, from one to the other. I think we have suffered, from not many people knowing about Indonesia. Not many people in the right places knowing about Indonesia. So that's, I think, the most fundamental area that we've got to work on in terms of our having to elevate the level of awareness with respect to Indonesia. That we're doing. We're basically going out, reaching out to different parts of the world, to the US, to Europe, and many parts in Asia Pacific, just to let everybody know that Indonesia is actually a $650 billion economy this year in 2010, that it has 140 million people, the third largest democracy, a Muslim modernity, the largest Muslim country in the world, which I know a lot of people in Oklahoma don't know about. That, I think, is being remedied as we go. Now, beyond that, I think we would like to basically socialize and educate, the international community with respect to, some of the other positivities of Indonesia. I think not many people also know, the fantastic demographic dividend or bonus that Indonesia entails. 60% of the population is, 39 years old or younger. 50% of the population is 29 years old or younger. That, I think, contrasts with, the situation in countries like Japan and China. And as you all know, we have a pretty competitive, economic environment, which I think is to be reckoned with. Let's not forget, we've been able to show stability from a political standpoint, macro political standpoint, and also from a macroeconomic standpoint. Years ago, 11 or 12 years ago, I think if you had talked to me about Indonesia, it would have been tough for us to actually be projecting Indonesia in a positive way, in a realistic manner. Now I think we've got those two elements, the macroeconomic stability and the macro-political stability. From an economic standpoint, we've been able to show fiscal sustainability. We've been able to show monetary stability for years, the last 5-6 years. And there is no, apparent inflationary pressure, coming in ways that we had seen, a few years ago. And our ability to balance our budget has been, I think, recognized by the international community, particularly the ratings agencies, and our ability to trim down our debt to a mere 28% debt to GDP ratio. I think that's commendable, especially if you put that in the context of what some of the other economies in the world are going through today. So you've got, I think, the macroeconomic stability story to tell.
Right.
And then the political stability, we've gone through, a rather difficult democratization earlier on. But I think we've been able to show to the rest of the world that we have democratized in a good way. And, there's no apparent centrifugal force now that could rip, the country apart like, many people thought 11 or 12 years ago. So you can tick off those boxes on the politics and the economy. Beyond that, I think one needs to take into account Indonesia's ability to, remedy its mistakes. I think Indonesia needs to stop being known as a country of tsunamis, earthquakes, and floods, and all the negativities that have been portrayed in many, international, media. But I think the world needs to understand Indonesia in a different way. It has been more misunderstood than it deserved. And that's what we're trying to remedy by going out, sit down with think tank organizations and people within the academia and people within executive decision-making bodies. And I would prefer to spend more time with people within the academia than and also the think tank, as opposed to speaking in front of hundreds of businessmen who, at the end of the day, would have to rely on opinions, being shaped and formed by people who actually understand, or at least are willing to understand Indonesia better. Yeah.
Now, since we're talking about macroeconomic stability and the picture, let's talk a little bit about some of the headlines that we see these days in the news. And I'd love to know from you what your sense is of their impact on the Indonesian economy. For example, these days there's a lot of discussion about what's likely to be happening with Europe. The US part of the recession, went on for a while, but who knows when the second shoe will drop in Europe. What's the impact on Indonesia likely to be? Do you get a lot of your FDI from there? Could that be impacted?
Well, I think many have recognized that the recovery that we're seeing in the U.S. and also in Japan is rather broad-based, and that I think we take comfort in. But what's happening with Europe, I think, is not only concerning to the Europeans, but I think it could concern many in the rest of the world. Fortunately, our linkage with the European Union countries from a trade standpoint, our export propensity to Europe, the European Union countries, and also the bank claims ratio in terms of banks that could claim back their, exposure with, papers that are being issued by the Indonesian government or Indonesian corporates is not significant as for us to be too concerned. But I do believe this, though. I think we have an exposure that is quite, large with other countries outside Europe that have, I think, quite a significant exposure with the European Union countries. So in an indirect manner, I think we have to be cautious, in terms of how we, go forward. How is all this going to impact, investment flows coming from Europe? I think it could have a pretty serious impact. But, we have to, underline the point that, a good chunk of the investment coming into Indonesia has thus far been coming from Asian countries, the Southeast Asian countries and the Japans of the world and the Koreas and increasingly Taiwan and mainland China. Although we're seeing an increasing amount coming from the U.S., in the last quarter or so. So we've got to be cautious, but I think we've got to basically continue deepening our communication with some of the members, some of the, countries that have been loyal and contributing to the investment map in Indonesia.
The other major news development recently, of course, is China's decision to let its currency appreciate, perhaps in preparation for the G20 discussions in Canada. What impact do you see that having on Indonesian exports?
I think it's potentially enormous because of two accounts. Number one, if you take a look at the economic structure of China and that of Indonesia, I think there's a great degree of complementarity. China, for the last 20 years, has been driven by investments, and Indonesia has been driven for the last 15 years by domestic consumptions. And China is trying to move the pendulum from an investment-centric economy to more of the human capital development and more of the domestic consumption stuff. Whereas Indonesia needs to move its reliance on, domestic consumption for the economy to a more investment-centric behavior. So that complementarity, I think, will play out nicely if we get our act together in terms of boosting investments, in terms of, inviting and encouraging Chinese investors to come to Indonesia. And second is the increased strength of the yuan or the renminbi, which will, I think, solidify the Chinese position to even be shopping for more goods and services, and also hopefully for more investments abroad in Indonesia. And we have seen, a significant expression of interest by many Chinese companies. The numbers in terms of realization have not been as staggering as the expression of interest. But there's always a lag between expression of interest and actualization of the investment. But we have made a couple of trips to China in the last few months, and we have been visited by throngs of Chinese companies who have expressed their interest in building the infrastructure, building the power generation capabilities, roads and bridges on the back of their keen interest in getting natural resources from Indonesia, such as coal, bauxite, nickel, iron ore, and all that. So I think we've got to be cognizant of ensuring that there is value optimization. Not that we don't want to just be selling coal and natural resources, but I think we've got to attract whoever, including the Chinese, in terms of helping us create more of a value added to the value chain.
Speaking of human capital development, as you correctly said, Indonesian economy has been based to some degree on domestic consumption, also to some degree on the successful use of natural resources.
Right.
How do you envisage moving from that to a knowledge-based economy? And do you have a sort of strategic vision for how Indonesia could go there?
We do. I mean, if you take a look at our investment roadmap, I think the first phase obviously involves the quick wins.
Right.
The quick wins, unfortunately or fortunately, involve some of the more natural resource-centric investment thesis. But we're trying to go to the second phase of basically creating infrastructure, soft and hard. Not just building roads and power generation capabilities, but the soft part, which is really creating more capacity building so that we can weed out policies which are confusing, policies which are, a little too ad hoc, with a view that we can go forward more in a strategic manner as opposed to tactical. And I think the investments into the infrastructure, soft and hard, will entail, our ability to go to the third phase of the large-scale, industrialization, which we need, because we need to ensure that there's, vertical integration in the value chain, and we've got to move away from just natural resource. We've got to ensure that we go to the downstream side of it. We don't just sell bauxite, but we've got to build smelters. We don't just sell cocoa, but we've got to build the chocolate factories. We don't just sell palm oil, we've got to build the refinery. Similarly with the oil and gas. That will, I think, add value and also create jobs. Our president is hugely committed about the three-pronged strategy: pro-job, pro-growth, pro-poor. And without the vertical integration and the value added, we're not going to achieve the pro-growth and pro-job, and surely the pro-poor. Now, is that likely to happen soon? The large-scale industrialization? I think it could, if we do not only take the non-fiscal view, but we've got to take a fiscal view of things. I think we've got to be able to basically not just map out, but take a view on certain industries which we want to support that would create a lot of value, but we've got to be able to provide the necessary fiscal structure and space, whether that involves giving fiscal incentives or what have you. That I think we've got to really, make a decision on soon. Now, if we can get that done, I think you can see Indonesia's ability to manufacture goods and services in a big way, which I think can allow us to position ourselves as a knowledge-based economy, which is our last phase of the, investment roadmap. That's, I think, a 10 to 15-year view of the Indonesian, investment roadmap. Now, I do take comfort in this because, again, we've got the demographic bonus,
Right.
and then let's not forget, the government's commitment in terms of educating the society. Now, the government is allocating 20% of its budget indirectly and directly for purposes of education. That's a larger number than whatever we saw, 6 or 7 years ago, which was on a single-digit basis. Now, I think with that kind of a commitment in terms of infusing soft power and software into the society, I think we've got a good chance.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, with that background about the economy, let's turn to some of the specific things that you are doing at BKPM to advance this mission
Right.
forward. The very first question that struck me was what the elevation of the office to a ministry meant in terms of your ability to tackle some of the challenges that you might lay ahead. Any thoughts on that?
I think it mattered, but I don't think it mattered as much as people think.
Okay.
Because I think a lot of what we have done, I think, is mainly out of the institution's own initiatives, as opposed to the fact that it is ministerial, in terms of levels. One classic example that I can point out is our ability to create this one-stop shop, right, which came into implementation in February this year. This was a delegation of authority from 15 different ministers. And one may think that it's tough to get one signature from one minister. We were able to get those, in relatively a short period of time. And with that, we were able to simplify investment decision-making process in Jakarta. Now we can issue a license in 5 hours, okay? Unlike how people might have thought, or unlike the reality long time ago, or not too long time ago. At the longest, 7 days, okay? Now we can give you, immigration permits, labor permits, and all that without your having to go to all the different ministries, even the fiscal incentives for certain industries. Now, the challenge is to actually roll this out to all the 33 provinces,
Right.
all the 500 kabupatens or regencies. That's a monster in itself, and we have set a target to basically roll it out in 7 provincial capitals by the end of June of 2010, and by the end of the year in all 33 provincial capitals, including the 7 that we would have implemented by the end of June, and 40 kabupatens, the capitals of 40 regencies. I think if we can get this done, which I believe we can, we will see a significant value unlocking. Yeah.
What kind of barriers do you anticipate, or do you anticipate any barriers or resistance on the part of the provinces, simply in terms of the execution of rules and regulations?
Realistically, yes, we've got to anticipate that.
So how do you overcome those?
We have visited 28 provinces in the last, 3 months or so. We sat down with the governor, and in many cases with many of the bupatis, the regency heads. And we told them, look, we don't have a lot of jurisdiction. We're not bringing jurisdiction, but we're bringing money.
Yeah.
We're bringing investments, and investments do create jobs. And that song, turned out okay, with respect to the ears of many. And we have concocted this regional championship notion, which involves 7 provinces. So we have basically anointed 7 provinces as regional champions. And this was kind of cute because it balled up all the other provincial leaders. And because of the special attention that we're giving to the provincial leaders of these 7 provinces, and we mean business. I mean, we sit down with these 7, we go out of Indonesia, we promote, and we've been able to actualize really big investments, in some of these. And now the governors are talking. Now the remaining 26 governors are telling me, how come we're not selected as a champion?
Right.
And it's good. This positive discrimination, I think, has worked out nicely in the sense that, I tell them back, that, I'd like to make all 33 of you as regional champions in a short period of time. But, we can only start with 7, and let's try to standardize, our thinking and our, practice in terms of attracting investments to these provinces. And I'm quite comfortable that by virtue of sitting down and rubbing shoulders with these guys, we would be able to achieve a pretty significant target. And the mission, let's be very clear, is not just to promote Java. The mission is to promote investments into the outer Java or outside Java regions, because particularly in the eastern part of Indonesia, that's an area which I think needs development more than the other parts of Indonesia.
Right. There's also a certain amount of confusion about what has come to be called the negative investment list, especially on the part of international investors.
Correct.
Could you tell me a little bit about the history of this list? And sometimes in other places such restrictions are meant to protect domestic industry from international competition.
Right.
Was that the case here? And I understand that there are some plans to liberalize certain areas.
Yeah.
Could you tell us your thinking about these things?
The negative list is actually a list that tells the whole world, including domestic investors, what sectors they can or cannot invest in, and the extent to which they can invest in any particular sector. So it's as much as it has that negative connotation, it should have been called a positive list.
Yeah.
Because it talks about not only the sectors that you can invest in, but the extent to which. And we have actually taken a view to liberalize some sectors. And this is starkly different from how we crafted it, 4 or 5 years ago, in 2006 and 2007. This takes a purely sectoral approach. For any particular sector, the extent to which you can invest. We've decided to basically liberalize up to 40 sectors, unlike how it was in the past. And this is clear cut. And yes, we have not decided to open up some sectors, which I know foreign investors would have, I think, loved But
Which ones are you not opening up?
the one that we have decided to close clearly is the telco towers, the telecommunication towers. And that we had advocated for the opening up, but I think collectively the government has decided to keep it closed for now. But I think the word of encouragement is that we have taken out the language within this presidential decree, which was issued and signed on the 25th of May this year. We've taken out the language that this negative list could only be reviewed every 3 years. So there is an open-mindedness, in terms of spirit. And I have always basically told everybody in Indonesia and outside Indonesia that to the extent you've got a view on a certain sector, in terms of how it ought to be closed or opened up, there's a mechanism with which we go forward with this, and that mechanism involves the cost-benefit analysis of any particular sector being opened up or closed. And we have also asserted the language of hierarchy. In the past, we did not have clarity on this. You would have a presidential decree, you would have a ministerial decree, you would have a collective ministerial decree, you would have a dirjen decree, and all that on an ad hoc basis. Those were slightly confusing. We've taken that, into consideration and put a language on the hierarchy of law, and the presidential decree surely, supersedes a ministerial decree or any other, decree lower than the ministry. So this is a progress and a process. Is it perfect? Is it ideal? Perhaps not. But if we take a portrait of this and compare it with how the portrait would look like in the past, I certainly think this is a lot better than how it looked previously. And we have basically sat down with the foreign chambers and many of the local Chamber of Commerce members, and I think net they're quite happy with it.
So it sounds like you're doing quite a few things to move in a positive direction. You're creating greater transparency about different sectors and the amount of investment that's possible. You're opening up 40 sectors for investment. Now let's assume that international capital responds and you start an influx of capital coming into these areas. What kinds of returns can international investors expect to earn in these sectors, and how would they compare to earn the returns that they might get in similar investments
in other countries,
say the BRIC countries?
Well, that's a longer conversation, but I'll give you my 2 cents worth. I think you've got to take into account the trajectory of Indonesia.
Right.
I think if one takes a 5 to 10 year view of Indonesia, I think it looks pretty good. Yeah. As an investment thesis. And at the rate that we're significantly underhyped compared to some of the other countries. And you've been to Vietnam, you've seen the infrastructure out there. I think we've got a pretty good infrastructure in Jakarta and many other cities in Indonesia. And let's not forget, Fitch and Standard & Poor's have upgraded us recently. We're rated BB plus by Fitch.
When do you expect to get to investment grade?
I do expect that in the next 12 to 18 months, realistically. I do think that with the continuation of the fiscal discipline and the fiscal decentralization that's being done as we speak, and the improvement that we're making in terms of the investment climate, and on the monetary side, with what we've talked about earlier, I do think there's no reason for us not to be an investment grade country in the next 12 to 18 months. And that's going to reduce capital.
Right.
And that's going to improve your IRR calculation. At the rate that we are committing $50 billion from a budgetary standpoint for the development of the infrastructure for the next 5 years. And that's part and parcels of the whole $150 billion infrastructure development program that we're going to launch, that we're launching actually. That's going to entail the development of 20,000 kilometers of roads, 15,000 megawatts of power generation. That's going to create a much higher degree of connectivity than whatever we have today. And that's also going to reduce capital, cost of capital. So if you take those two things into account and take into account the fact that we're underhyped, and take into account some of the other stuff that I've mentioned, the natural resource, the demographic bonus, and political stability and all that, I think this presents an enormous opportunity for anybody.
Right.
You know.
Actually, you brought up a point that I found very interesting. That is, why is it that the cost of capital in Indonesia tends to be higher than in other places?
Well, I think, if you take into account the swap or the credit, default swap, it is reflective of the perceived risk. Right. And I do believe that as more and more people do not misunderstand Indonesia as much as before, that perception of risk will lessen. And that, I think, will reduce the premium. And that, I think, will surely, reduce the cost of capital for Indonesia to borrow in US dollars. And with a declining, swap rate, you're going to see, I think, a continuing declination in terms of the cost of capital in rupiah. And I think the government is aware of this and is also in the process of basically trying to figure out a way to elongate the instrumentation for debt so that that can be channeled to support the infrastructure development, which has not taken place yet. But to the extent that takes place, I think we're not going to see as much liquidity trap as we have seen thus far. And that, I think, will help reduce the cost, structure for Indonesia.
Yeah, I'll come back in a little bit to the risk aspect.
Yeah.
But since you referred to the fact a couple of times that Indonesia is so underhyped, can you give me a realistic view of an FDI investment in Indonesia that really worked in a realistic sense for the country, for the economy, and for the investor?
In terms of amounts, or?
Of say some FDI investment
Right.
that was made by a company.
Sure.
Just let's tell the positive story.
Sure. Well, first of all, in the first quarter, FDI went up by 41%. Okay? And from what we're detecting in the second quarter, I think that momentum is likely to continue. Overall, investment has spiked up by 25% in the first quarter. So there is a declination from a domestic standpoint. But domestic has been a much smaller component of the whole investment flow. Now, in terms of cases, we've been able to attract a large, Middle Eastern player from Ras Al Khaimah to build, this integrated infrastructure project in East Kalimantan to build a port 139 kilometer rail track and a 1,300 megawatt power generation capability and a 500,000 ton capacity of smelter and a coal mine, which they bought also. They've started. They have poured, quite a significant amount of money. This is all going to total to about 5.2 billion US. They have basically been able to clear most of the land on which they'll build the rail track. And we've also, been able to convince Holcim from Switzerland to do a massive expansion, for their cement capabilities. And we're also in talks with a large, or one of the largest in the world, electronics manufacturing firm in Asia to basically relocate their manufacturing capability for Southeast Asia purposes to Indonesia. all these are tangible results that we've been able to produce in the last few months. And this is a result of what has been done before also. And I do believe as more and more people understand that the cost competitiveness of Indonesia, particularly from a labor standpoint, and with the declination of cost of capital like we talked about earlier, and hyping Indonesia a little bit more, that it is a country with positivities, I do believe more and more will come. The end game is quite simple. The end game is to be able to convince somebody from Omaha, Nebraska to put $1 in Indonesia. And I do believe if I can do that, the billions will come. And we've been able to do that with some of the large players in Asia, in the Middle East and all that. But as we do more and more and we prove to the world that we can actually remedy our mistakes, and you know, these guys take a 5 to 10 year view of a country, I do believe we can make something happen.
What's your view of the potential for private equity in Indonesia, and how does that compare to private equity's prospects in other parts of Asia?
Oh, I think it's enormous. Look, let's take a look at the market cap of the Indonesian stock market. It hovers around 220 billion US.
Right.
I think the amount of private equity funds that have been invested or managed with respect to Indonesia is very small. In absolute value, we're not talking about no more than $2 billion US, and as a ratio to the whole market cap of the Indonesian stock exchange or stock market, it's a small percentage. Now, if you put that in the context of the economy, I mean, the economy is a staggering $650 billion economy. It's the largest in ASEAN. I mean, the second largest is that of Thailand at what, 280 billion, and then Malaysia at 220, and Singapore at 170, give and take. We're now the largest, economy in ASEAN. We're a member of the G20, and that economy of 650 billion US is going to grow in 2014 to around $1 trillion US. So looking at how small the private equity funds that are being managed for Indonesia in terms of around 2 to 3 billion US, and put that in the context of the market cap and the economy, I think it presents an enormous opportunity for many to take a look at Indonesia.
That's great. And you also referred to the fact that Indonesia has a very young population, and you refer to the demographic dividend. What kind of efforts are you making to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation to create new jobs through venture capital, for example? Are you making any efforts in that direction?
Yes, but not substantially yet. I think we need to take a view on how we can cultivate the small, medium entrepreneurship. And if you take a look at the bulk of the investment flows into Indonesia, from within and from without, a lot of them actually relate to small, medium, enterprises. And that, I think, involves entrepreneurship, in a big way. I think we need to think about how to, number one, promote these in a bigger way, and number two, how to lead them to a more innovative thought processes, whether that includes, the thinking of going to the capital markets model after a few years for exit mechanism purposes, or for value crystallization purposes, or value maximization purposes. This is still in a thought, stage. I think this is a homework that we've got to, do in the next, hopefully, couple to 3 years. But we've also got to sit down with the other relevant ministries, the Ministry of Cooperatives, and the Ministry of State-Owned Enterprises and the Ministry of Finance. Because, if we refer back to the old days of, 15 years ago, there was a subsidy mechanism, from the banking system in terms of interest rate subsidies for small, medium enterprises. That system was abolished. Yeah, I'm not suggesting that we should re-implement that, but I think we need to identify and come up with a mechanism that would catalyze, small, medium entrepreneurship in a bigger way, because that, I think, is what will sustain economic growth.
What does music mean to you?
Music is everything to me.
And how has it been a source of personal growth?
It's tremendously. I mean, it's, I went to the U.S. on a music scholarship.
I know that.
And I unfortunately or fortunately, I had to switch major to accounting because, my parents were not too thrilled. But it has been a source of creativity and dynamism in whatever I've been doing thus far. And it has, I think, shown up a little bit in some of the stuff we're doing at BKPM.